My name is Hector Ayala. For more than 30 years, I've traveled the endless highways of Mexico and the United States, carrying my burden and my story. With every kilometer I've traveled, I've faced storms, bad roads and worse attacks, lonely stretches in the desert heat, as well as the biting cold of the snowy forest. I thought I'd seen it all until that night in the Sierra de Puebla, on a stretch leading to Coxcatlán. With my experience, I knew the road held secrets, but I never imagined that destiny would lead me to face an incarnate nightmare. The thick forest seemed to come alive with every kilometer, and my mind, accustomed to dodging potholes and facing adversity, shuddered at the inexplicable, and for a moment, the weight of my years on the road became an unbearable burden. I knew the road had been my companion and my refuge, but that night, on a forgotten stretch, the path transformed into a labyrinth of terrors, and a dark force that seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth called to me, inviting me to delve even deeper into the unknown. And there, at that intersection between experience and the abyss, I realized that nothing I had experienced compared to the horror that awaited me. The road, with its abandon, promised to reveal secrets that perhaps would be better left unsaid. I remember the road was empty as always, especially on that stretch before reaching a nearby town whose name I don't remember. It was miles and miles of asphalt, and then the road cut into a kind of paved gap that had too many potholes to move quickly and was illuminated only by my truck's headlights. The radio tuned to a regional music station, but the signal suddenly began to fail, filling the cabin with an annoying static. I turned off the car and remained silent, alone with the roar of the engine and the wind beating against the windows. It was a cold night, one of those that chills you to the bone, and even though I'd been driving for hours, I didn't feel sleepy. Something in the air kept me alert as if the road itself were watching me. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe or a coyote like so many I'd encountered along the way, dead, muddy on the pavement. But as I got closer, the shape became clearer. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. I slammed on the brakes and the truck squealed across the asphalt, kicking up dust and smoke, stopping a few feet from the body. My heart pounded and my hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and thought, it must have been an accident. Someone had hit him and left him. It wasn't unusual there, that always happened, and I must sadly say that I too have taken on lonely night walkers and didn't have you in my path, but they appear out of nowhere. And so, how do you stop with all the weight you're carrying? It's impossible. So all you do is simply continue on your way and not think about it. After stopping beside the body, I got out of the truck, feeling the icy wind hit my face. The body was face down in the middle of the lane. It was a woman, at least that's what it looked like, since she was wearing a cotton dress. White, now stained with dirt and something darker, clotted blood. I approached slowly, calling to her, even though I knew she wouldn't respond, and when I was close enough, I realized something was terribly wrong. She was completely dismembered. It was a horrible sight. I didn't know who had hurt her like that. Her legs and arms were separated from her torso, arranged in a strange pattern, as if someone had wanted to form a symbol with them. Her head was to one side, her dark hair partially covering her face. I bent down, trembling, and carefully brushed the hair aside with a branch I found there. The poor wretch's eyes were open, glassy, and her mouth was set in a grimace of terror, but that wasn't the most terrifying thing. On her skin, written in blood, was a message, or at least that's what it looked like. Since it was letters or symbols, I wasn't sure. I just walked away, trembling and disgusted by the scene. It's not that death scares me, it's the way that woman looked. I'd seen photos and mysterious things on social media before about crimes and other filthiness that you suddenly see and don't believe it would happen or that you'd ever see something like that, but it was staring me in the face. My blood was running cold and I jumped up. Looking around, I thought I was being watched, that it had been a trap or something to get me out of the way, or worse. The road was empty and very quiet. There was no sign of another vehicle or anyone else, just me, the truck, and that mutilated body. So I went back to the phone booth and tried to call the police, but there was no signal. The phone was dead. So I cursed under my breath and, determined to get away from there as quickly as possible, set off again, but then something caught my attention, making me get out of the truck again. Near the body there was a trail of blood. It wasn't a puddle around the corpse. It was an irregular line leading into the woods, as if someone had dragged something there, leaving a disgusting path between the mingled dirt and blood. I froze, staring at that dark road. My instinct screamed at me to get in the truck and get out of there, to forget everything I had seen, but something else, something deeper and darker, was pushing me on. I can't explain it clearly, but it was as if fate itself, as if a force was driving me to satisfy a curiosity that suddenly settled in my gut. "What the hell are you doing, Hector?" I asked quietly, but I was already walking toward the woods, following the blood trail, armed with a flashlight and my Swiss Army knife. The forest was dense, and the light from my flashlight barely illuminated a few meters. Ahead, branches scraped my arms and face, and the ground was flat, as if it had recently rained. The trail of clotted blood continued, and each step became heavier than the next. Colder. I felt like someone was watching me behind me, but every time I turned around there was no one, and after what seemed like an eternity, the trail ended in a clearing, and there I saw it. They were lights, small, flickering like cogas. Well, that's what I thought they were at first, but then everything was like a flash of green next to them that didn't seem natural. Something was floating in the air, forming a circle around something I couldn't make out. So I approached slowly, turning off the flashlight and guided by those lights, feeling fear take over every sense. Every step was a struggle against my own instinct to flee. When I was close enough, I saw what those lights were illuminating. It was some kind of altar made of stacked volute stones with black candles burning with a bluish flame. On top of it were strange objects, bones, feathers, and something that looked like a heart, and you got the impression it was still beating. It was perhaps the heart of that woman I found. The smell was nauseating. It was a mixture of rotten flesh and something sweet like sandalwood incense. I moved closer, unable to tear my gaze away from it all. And then I saw something I recognized immediately. It was a symbol carved into the ground, right in front of the altar. It was large, intricate, and seemed to be made from the dried blood of the trail that had led me to that place. It was some kind of satanic seal, a star with a circle. There were no signs of it around it, but something about it made me feel a deep sense of unease. As soon as I saw it, it was as if I were witnessing something I shouldn't have seen, and suddenly the candlelight went out. My flashlight wouldn't turn on anymore. I was left in complete darkness, and the silence was absolute. I couldn't even hear my own breathing, and I felt something moving around me, something large and invisible. The air became unbreathable. Suddenly, a murmur could be heard behind my ear. It was a language I didn't understand. I understood an indigenous dialect, I could recognize that much, but I felt like those words were shaking me in many ways. From the depths of my being, I wanted to get away, but the trail I'd followed led me to a dirt road that became narrower and more treacherous, slippery, and with the cursed tree branches that seemed to reach out toward me like claws ready to catch me. There, the air, already cold, turned icy, and every breath felt like inhaling blades of ice that burned my flashlight. It could barely be turned on. I banged on it and it trembled in my hands in the flickering light. Weakly, I had to move forward. I wanted to go back, but instead of taking the path back to the highway, I took another that led deeper into a wooded area. I knew I shouldn't go any further and that I was getting closer to something I didn't want to see, but I couldn't stop. I don't know if it was curiosity fueled by something pulling me, as if an invisible rope were tied to my chest, dragging me forward in that trail of blood. She had become more like a roe deer. I could smell her fresher, that metallic, sweet scent mingling with the stinking damp earth and rot. My boots sank into the mud, and every meter was a struggle against the weight that seemed to accumulate in my legs. The forest was too quiet, not a single sound of animals, not the wind rustling the leaves, just the tapping of my footsteps and the quickened beating of my heart, and after I left that wooded area, the scene that opened before me left me paralyzed in the center of a chain of. There were trees. A monumental bonfire rose toward the starry sky, its green and blue flames dancing in a mysterious and strange way. It was an impossible fire. It was as if those flames were alive, and around that conflagration, there was a group of women dressed in dirty, faded blanket hip piles, forming a perfect circle around the fire. Their faces were covered in mud, it seemed, but I could see their eyes. They were completely black, with a mysterious and penetrating emptiness that gave off blood, and they were fixed on the flames, murmuring in that dialect, one I didn't recognize, and the words seemed to vibrate in the air, making my skin crawl. In the center of that circle, one of the women, perhaps the oldest because of her long gray braid wrapped around her waist, was holding a small child. There my senses were immediately alerted. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, no bigger than my own son, one I'd abandoned long ago and remembered. He was naked, his pale white skin shining in the light of the flames. The child wasn't crying, he wasn't moving, he didn't react to that horror. He was in a kind of trance, his eyes closed as if he were asleep. The woman who picked him up, her arms with him, was preparing to throw him into the fire, and then I immediately reacted. Without thinking, I ran toward them, yelling for them to stop. I wanted to save that little boy. There were no more than 6 women, all short and thin, perhaps elderly. What could those damned women do to me? But I was wrong. The moment I crossed the edge of the circle, an invisible force struck me with the force of a sledgehammer in the face and chest. I fell to the ground, the air leaving my lungs. With a groan, I tried to gasp for air, but I couldn't. I tried to get up, but my body didn't respond either, and it was as if a heavy stone slab had fallen on top of me, crushing it. I couldn't move. The women seemed not to notice my attempts, my poor attempts to save the little boy, and so they continued with their ritual. Their voices rose, and the woman holding the little boy lifted him higher. His arms stretched out toward the flames, and suddenly that little boy opened his eyes, and at that moment I knew he was conscious. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw a fear so profound it made me want to scream. I tried to do so, but my voice wouldn't come out, and the woman simply threw him into the fire without any pity, fear, or fear of God. When she did, time seemed to stand still. I saw the little boy fall into the flames, his body engulfed by that green and blue fire that seemed not to consume him, but to absorb him between the child's screams of anguish, pain, and fear. The women's voices reached a climax, and suddenly the fire exploded into the sky, forming a gigantic figure. I know I wasn't hallucinating, but that fire transformed into a creature, or I don't know what it was. I can't describe it with words because it was too large, too unnatural. Its eyes burned with the same fire, and its mouth was a twisted slit that opened in the flames, forming a kind of silent scream. That thing seemed to be looking at me. And in that instant I knew I was in the presence of something evil. The weight of my body increased, and I felt something grinding inside me, as if this creature were probing my mind or my soul, I don't know. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't look away. They burned as I did so. The next thing I saw was those women, who began to writhe, their bodies contorting in impossible ways, as if they were being possessed by something. Their voices turned into heart-rending screams, and the air was filled with the smell of sulfur and burning flesh, and soon those women were engulfed by the fire, but they weren't consumed, they disappeared into it. That creature of flames extended a burning appendage toward me, and in that instant I knew I was going to burn to death. But before it could touch me, everything went black, the pain disappeared, I could breathe, and I simply lay there in silence. I woke up in my truck sweating and shaking. The sun was already high and the road was empty. For a moment I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I noticed the smell of burning and something else. I looked toward the passenger seat, and there was a black cloth covering something that shouldn't be there. With trembling hands I lifted it, and beneath this cursed cloth was a human head. It was a woman's head, perhaps the same one I had found, but there were no remains of anything in front of it. Just a dark stain on the pavement. The most horrendous part of this macabre discovery was the eyes and mouth. They were sewn shut with black thread, and there was a sheet of paper stuck to the forehead. With a sentence written in shaky, poorly spelled handwriting, "Go your way, the witches are watching you," the note read. All I could do was throw my head out the window and hit the road, speeding full throttle. But I knew I couldn't escape. After delivering the late cargo, there were times when I couldn't feel well anymore. The following days were a nightmare. I tried to resume my normal life, to convince myself that everything I had experienced in that mountain clearing had been a hallucination, a product of fatigue and stress, but I couldn't. Something was chasing me. At first they were small things moving in the rearview mirrors, dark black, when I was sure there was no one else on the road. They appeared, plus I could hear murmurs in the night so low I could almost believe they were imaginary, but they would wake me up with my heart racing, and that smell, God, that burning smell that seemed to permeate everything around me, even when there was nothing to explain it. Such were my unbearable days. Torture until one afternoon I stopped in a nearby town. Near Taken, it was a small, dusty place with adobe houses and empty streets. I needed to rest and eat something other than canned food and feel human again, to forget everything for a few moments. So I parked the truck near a plaza and walked toward a taco stand that smelled of grilled meat and onions. As I ate, very hungrily, an old man approached me. I planned to chase him away immediately. I didn't want anyone to bother me. He was a beggar. Begging or something, I didn't care, I just wanted to forget everything. When I wanted to turn around to insult him, he was no longer there. He was on the other side. I hadn't seen him move or arrive. He was just there suddenly, and as if he'd appeared out of nowhere, he appeared with a mysterious figure. He was a short, thin man with dark skin and deep eyes filled with a wisdom that made me feel uneasy. He wasn't a beggar, he was someone else. He stared at me as if he could see something in me that I couldn't. He could do that, and he said in a very faint voice as if he wanted no one to hear, "You've upset the witches, boy." I froze, not knowing what to say, how to react, and the old man leaned closer. His breath smelled of herbs and tobacco. "They won't rest until they have you. You have that mark on your neck, you're cursed," he continued. Instinctively I brought my hand to my neck. I hadn't noticed anything before, but now, beneath my fingers, I felt a bump, a kind of rough scar, and I ran toward the truck. Reaching for the rearview mirror, I took off my shirt. And I looked at myself, leaning against the step, and there it was. It was a red mark like a burn, shaped like a symbol I didn't recognize. It was small but distinct, as if someone had burned it into my skin with a red-hot iron. "It can't be," I murmured, touching the mark with my fingers. It didn't hurt, but I felt a strange warmth, as if it were alive. The old man was behind me, staring. "The mark is a witch's mark. Somehow you've disturbed these women. There are many around here, and when they mark you, you can't escape. Ouch. Son, who knows what evil or what things you saw, but you really should stay away from this whole place. There's nothing good for you here. Heed my warning. If you continue down those roads, one day you'll meet them. I don't really know why they allowed you to live and get to where you did, because I'm sure you saw something you shouldn't have, but if you don't escape now, if you don't get out of here, one day you're going to wake up dead or your truck is going to go over the edge." After he said this, that old man simply turned around and limped away, leaning on a cane. I tried to ignore him, thanked him, but he didn't listen. I thought everything would be okay, that I shouldn't worry, but deep down I knew he was right. And that night, while I was sleeping in the cab of the truck, I had a vision. I was in the clearing again, in that damned clearing, surrounded by those indigenous women. Their faces were covered, but I could feel their black eyes fixed on me. One of them approached. Her feet were bare, and they made no sound as they walked on the ground. She seemed to be floating over it. She was holding something in her hands, something small and shiny. Then he extended his hand and said to me, "You are part of the offering now." His voice was twisted, as if from another world. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was frozen like that night in the clearing. All those indigenous women moved closer, forming a circle around me, and I felt the air grow heavier, colder, and I felt something moving inside me, in my gut, in my chest. I couldn't say for sure, but looking at their faces, covered in mud and forming an Adam's figure, as if they were trying to extract something from me, it made me shudder. Suddenly, the flesh opened, my guts spilled out, and out emerged the face of a screaming child as the infernal heat of the flames began to consume him and me. I woke up screaming, sweating cold. The truck was dark, silent, but the burnt smell was still there, permeating the air. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't continue driving those damn roads the next day, simply. I abandoned the truck, left it parked somewhere, and took a bus to Puebla. That was the place I knew, where I grew up, where the family I had abandoned was. I wanted to reconnect with my son, but I couldn't find him anymore, as if I wanted to assuage all my guilt. Finding myself alone and without a peso in my pocket, I had to find a job at a convenience store. It was a simple, uncomplicated job, far from the roads and the mountains, far from the hills. I tried to convince myself that I was safe there, that I could stop. Again, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night the witches returned. Sometimes they were in the clearing and other times in my room, speaking in dialect words I didn't understand, but which I felt deep within me. The smell of burning was still there, although less intense, and the mark on my neck never disappeared. Sometimes in the mirror I swore I saw it glow as if it were alive, and I knew I couldn't escape the witches. I had their mark. To this day I must say with some shame, to this day I must say with some caution, that I live in anxiety, in a state of knowing that perhaps one day they will find me. I have lived a solitary life, far from the roads and mountains, but even so I feel them calling me. Sometimes I only dream of walking down a long road at night, staring at the endless line of asphalt and the signs directing me to one destination: hell. I leave my testimony and believe what you want to believe.